let's start with the Gaza ceasefire there. Those images that we're seeing, 300,000 civilians, residents returning home to the north for the first time really since the war began. This ceasefire, as fragile as it is continuing to hold. Israel had accused Hamas of reneging on some of the promises made in terms of this deal regarding the hostages to be released. But Prime Minister Netanyahu secured himself somewhat of a win this week, because there will be two separate releases, one on Thursday now and Friday. But given all of that, I wanted you to respond to a column and a specific quote from Israeli journalist Amos Harel in Haaretz in terms of where things go moving from phase one of the deal to even more complicated portions of phase two and phase three. Here's what he said. Hamas made a tactical concession to complete a strategic gain. He's referencing this week, namely the return of Gazans to the north of the Strip. Once they're back in their ruined communities, it will be difficult for Israel to resume the war and evacuate them again from areas that the army wants to occupy, even if the ceasefire agreement collapses at the end of the 6 weeks that compromise its first stage. Do you agree with this assessment, Nabih, that despite internal pressure that Prime Minister Netanyahu may be facing from some fringes in his coalition, despite statements that he's made that the U.S. has even agreed this is a temporary ceasefire, that realistically it would be very, very difficult for him, both domestically, physically, and given international pressure, namely from Donald Trump, to actually pull out of this ceasefire at some point now that we're having residents return home to the north?
Well, the fact is that Netanyahu has been banking for quite some time on the leniency or perhaps support of Donald Trump when it comes to Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And so, I mean, perhaps one part of his calculation is that Trump would actually support any move that he does when it comes to Gaza, especially in light of his recent comments about cleaning it out, et cetera, et cetera. But in more practical sense, of course, it will be much more difficult to uproot people again now that they're back. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands who have returned, and they've already started setting up camp in various parts of the northern Gaza Strip. And so, again, I mean, obviously there would be international pressure, I mean, perhaps from parties other than the U.S., but also from Arab neighbors and people who are, or I should say, sides that are expected to cooperate with Israel in any future ceasefire implementation as well, because it should be noted that Israel does need, I suppose, Arab nations or other countries and other parties to help in the reconstruction of Gaza eventually.
Yeah, and the prime minister and maybe some of the right wing in his government may be banking on Donald Trump just greenlighting anything they want to do. But from a lot of our own reporting, Donald Trump is keen on keeping the ceasefire in place and looking even ahead towards a Saudi normalization deal that would require this ceasefire to be implemented. And given that, he may be the only voice that can put the needed pressure on Netanyahu to keep this deal going. I do want to get you to respond before we move to Lebanon to President Trump's remarks that really seem to shock the world about moving Palestinians, uprooting them to countries like Jordan, Egypt. Those countries and their leaders have firmly said this is not going to happen, but he seems to have doubled down on this. We know Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming to the States, I believe, as soon as next week. How should these comments be interpreted, in your view?
Well, it should be noted that on the one hand, I mean, yes, this is a plan from Donald Trump, but the kernels of this plan were already there with the Biden administration. I mean, it's hard not to forget that Blinken. I mean, it's hard to forget that Blinken and other U.S. officials in the Biden administration actually were saying that there needs to be some kind of temporary displacement of Palestinians while combat operations happen in the Gaza Strip, and again, that was refused. Now, at the same time, of course, for Jordan, it's an existential matter. And the fact is, in Egypt, you know, it's perhaps different because Egypt, of course, is a far larger country, and there are some spaces in the Sinai area. But for Jordan, I mean, this would really be a no-go, because the fact is Jordan already has quite a large Palestinian population to begin with. Add to that is the fact that Jordan, at this point, I believe, has 11 million people in a land that could only sustain about 3 million people, and I'm not sure it can handle additional people coming in. At the same time, it relies on U.S. aid. I believe at this point to the tune of about $1.2 billion or something of that sort. And that is existential for Jordan when it comes to its annual, budget. So, yeah, I mean, of course, for Jordan, it is indeed a problem. Egypt, perhaps less so. But either way, these leaders have vociferously denied any kind of attempt to implement this plan. And I'd be hard pressed to imagine them I guess, accepting any version of it at this point.
Yeah. Let's move to Lebanon now, this extended ceasefire now through February 18th. First, do you think that Hezbollah will ultimately disarm and completely south of the Litani River, which is what Israel is saying that they're not doing, and thus why they've prolonged and extended their operation and presence there?
Well, there is some issue about what it means when we say Hezbollah is disarming in the south. I mean, at some level, there are people there in the south who are residents of the south, I should say, who are loyal to Hezbollah. Indeed, you could argue that much of the south is actually loyal to Hezbollah. Now, at the same time, when it comes to arms and arms position, Hezbollah has repeatedly said that it is willing to give up the south of the Litani, right? But the agreement does not apply to other parts of the country. Now, of course, Hezbollah actually used to possess, I guess, longer-range missiles and drones and things of that nature that could still threaten Israel's north. And so perhaps that is why it's accepting the notion of moving north of the Litani. But there's a bit of lack of clarity in that regard. And at the same time, Israel at this point has remained in place in border villages such as Killa and others. And it's actually prevented people from returning in recent days. And so the expectation is that Israel actually might end up staying for quite a bit longer, which would be a major problem for many of the Lebanese here.
And which would also disenfranchise and perhaps disempower the Lebanese armed forces as well, which one could argue would only benefit Hamas at the end of the day. Let's talk about a grain of positive news, perhaps, in a country that's in much need of it, and that is after a long political gridlock and deadlock. The country has chosen a president, and that is Joseph Aoun, and he appointed Nawaf Salam as prime minister, as a former ICJ president. He's a Sunni backed by Saudi and seen as an outside the traditional political oligarchy. And notably, Hezbollah has not, or these were not two names that Hezbollah would have put in charge here, both as president and as prime minister. Give us your reaction to this newly developing government. Nonetheless, there is some optimism around its potential. Talk about the mood in the country right now.
Well, yes, there certainly is optimism. I would say that's actually the dominant mood. And it should be said that Hezbollah, although it did not want Nawaf Salam, the prime minister, it did actually help in electing Joseph Aoun, but it was expecting they would have another PM that would be more in line with its priorities. At the same time, Hezbollah has to participate in the coming government. The fact is that if it chooses not to, then it's likely to lose even more influence. And at this point, it's lost its ability to sabotage government decisions because of its majority in parliament. It has lost that majority right now. And the fact is that Nawaf Salam, so far at least, has some major support across the political spectrum. So indeed, it is a moment of hope, and there is also hope of reform, wide-scale reform throughout all levels of the government. For example, now Nawaf Salam is actually forming his cabinet, and I mean, just to give you a sense of how things have changed. In the past, the expectation was that various parties would dictate who would actually be in certain ministries. So, for example, there was like this notion of apportioning certain ministries for certain parties or for certain leaders. Indeed, this actually went throughout the entire government. And I'll just give you another example of this. The head of the National Music Conservatory, for example, had to be from a certain sect. That's how far down the hierarchy, this sort of apportioning of sectarian segments went. Now, Nawaf Salam is saying that he plans to remove all that, and that he will be he'll be appointing various cabinet members according to his own desires, and with the idea of actually fulfilling the aim that he'd given out to the Lebanese people in previous days, which is to say that he wants to commit to a full-scale reconstruction and a wholesale reform of the public sector in the country.
Yeah, and that is something that is much needed. So all of these promises, at least, are well received. Given where Hezbollah is right now, its weakened state, Iran also weakened as well, there is a conversation to be had about what happens to its fighters and whether at all they could be integrated right now into the Lebanese armed forces. There are lessons to be learned, obviously, from the United States and Iraq as well. Do you think that is a realistic conversation to be had right now, and what's the likelihood that this could be implemented?
Well, it's a hard question, mostly because the Lebanese army in the past has been a matter of, or has maintained the sectarian balance in the country. Now, this is an important point because the Lebanese army has always been seen as above the various squabbling that happened in the Civil War and elsewhere. And so leaders have been very careful to maintain the sectarian balance when it comes to Christians, Muslims, whether they're Sunni or Shia, in the army. And integrating wholesale all the fighters of Hezbollah would, of course, cause a massive imbalance in that regard. At the same time, Hezbollah is at its weakest militarily because it's lost Syria and Iran's support to an extent. But at the same time, it remains to be the strongest actor in the country and perhaps in many ways the most organized. Now that hegemony has been broken to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean that it's completely out of the picture. And at the same time, it should be said that its support, or perhaps it had lost some support because of the war, but now the longer Israel remains in place in the south, and the more that popular support will return. And it should also be added that Hezbollah has now actually started a full-scale reconstruction effort when it comes to the various areas that were destroyed. In fact, I've heard from several people who have received certain payments as compensation for repairing windows and repairing walls, and more extensive reconstruction is also being paid out. So that is something right now.
And the concern is that the more Hezbollah frames itself as leading the charge of rebuilding, it could restore some of the support that it had lost over the course of the last year. Nabih Bullis, always good to see you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.